The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, and in Vietnam as the Resistance War against America, or simply the American War, was a conflict that occurred in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from November 1st, 1955 to the fall of Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975. It was the second of the Indochina Wars and was officially fought between North Vietnam and the government of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese army was supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other communist allies, and the South Vietnamese army was supported by the United States, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, and many other anti-communist allies. The war is therefore considered a Cold Era proxy war. The war is considered a humiliation for the United States. After several attacks upon them, it was decided by the U.S. Air Force bases needed more protection as the South Vietnamese military seemed incapable of providing security. On March 8, 1965, 3,500 U.S. Marines were dispatched to South Vietnam. This marked the beginning of the American Ground War. U.S. public opinion overwhelmingly supported the deployment. In a statement similar to that made to the French almost 2 decades earlier, Ho Chi Minh warned that if the Americans want to make war for 20 years, then we shall make war for 20 years. If they want to make peace, we shall make peace and invite them to afternoon tea. Some have argued that the policy of North Vietnam was not to topple other non-communist governments in Southeast Asia. The Marines' initial assignment was defensive. The first deployment of 3,500 in March 1965 was increased to nearly 200,000 by December. The U.S. military had long been in school in offensive warfare, regardless of political policies. U.S. commanders were institutionally and psychologically unsuited to a defensive mission. In December 1964, ARVN forces had suffered many losses in the Battle of Bang Gia, in a battle that had both sides viewed as a watershed. Previously, communist forces had utilized hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. However, at Bang Gia, they had defeated a strong ARVN force in a conventional battle. Tellingly, the South Vietnamese forces were again defeated in June 1965 at the Battle of Doang Xoa. Desertion rates were increased and morale plummeted. General William Westmoreland informed Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, Jr., commander of U.S. Pacific Forces, that the situation was critical. He said, "I am convinced that U.S. troops, with their energy, mobility, and firepower, can successfully take the fight to the NLF." With this recommendation, Westmoreland was advocating an aggressive departure of American defensive posture and the sidelining of the South Vietnamese. By ignoring ARVN units, the U.S. commitment became open-ended. Westmoreland outlined 3 points to win the war. Phase 1, commitment of U.S. and other free world forces necessarily to halt the losing trend by the end of 1965. Phase 2, U.S. and Allied forces mount major offensive actions to seize the initiative to destroy guerrilla and organized enemy forces. This phase would end when the enemy had been worn down, thrown on the defensive, and driven back to the major populated areas. Phase 3. If the enemy persisted, a period of 12 to 18 months following Phase 2 would be required for the final destruction of enemy forces remaining in the remote base areas. The plan was approved by Johnson and marked the profound departure from the previous administration's initiatives that the government of South Vietnam was responsible for defeating the guerrillas. Westmoreland predicted victory by the end of 1967. Johnson did not, however, communicate this change in strategy to the media. Instead, he emphasized continuity. The change in the U.S. policy depended on matching the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in a contest of adoration and morale. The opponents were locked in a cycle of escalation. The idea that the government of South Vietnam could manage its own affairs was shelved. The one-year tour of duty of American soldiers deprived units of their experienced leadership. As one observer noted, "We were not in Vietnam for 10 years, but for 1 year 10 times. As a result, training programs were shortened." South Vietnam was inundated with manufactured goods. As Stanley Carnell writes, the main PX, post exchange, located in the Saigon suburb of Cholon, was only slightly smaller than the New York Bloomingdale's. The American buildup transformed the economy and had profound effect on the South Vietnamese society. A huge surge in corruption was witnessed. Washington encouraged its pseudo-allies to contribute troops. Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines all agreed to send troops. Major allies, however, notably NATO, nations Canada, and the United Kingdom, declined Washington's troops request. The U.S. and its allies mounted complex operations such as Operation Masher, Attleboro, Cedar Falls, and Junction City. However, the communist insurgents remained elusive, and they demonstrated great tacticability flexibility. In late 1967, the Communists lured American forces into the hinterlands of Dak To and the Marine Quezon Combat Base in Quang Tri Province, where the United States was more willing to fight because it could unleash its massive firepower unimpeded by civilians. However, on the 30th of January 1968, the NVA and the Viet Cong broke the truce that traditionally accompanied the Tet holiday by launching the largest battle of the war, the Tet Offensive. In the hope of sparking a national uprising, over 100 cities were attacked by over 85,000 enemy troops, including the assaults on General Westmoreland's headquarters of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Although the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces were initially shocked by the large scale of this urban offensive, they responded quickly and effectively, decimating the ranks of the Viet Cong. In the former capital city of Hue, the combined NVA and Viet Cong troops captured the Imperial Citadel and much of the city and massacred over 3,000 unarmed Hue civilians. In the following Battle of Hue, American forces employed massive firepower that left 80% of the city in ruins. Furthermore, Quang Tri City members of the 1st Cavalry Division and the 1st ARVN Infantry Division killed more than 900 NVA and Viet Cong troops in and around the city. In Saigon, 1,000 NLF fighters fought off 11,000 U.S. and ARVN troops for 3 weeks. Across South Vietnam, 1,100 Americans and other Allied troops, 2,100 ARVN, 14,000 civilians, and 32,000 NVA and Viet Cong lay dead. During the course of the Vietnam War, a large segment of the American population came to oppose the U.S. involvement in South Vietnam. Public opinion steadily turned against the war following 1967, and by 1970, only a third of Americans believed that the U.S. had not made a mistake by sending troops in Vietnam. Nearly a third of the American population were strongly against the war. It is possible to specify certain groups who led the anti-war movement, and the reasons why. Many young people protested because they were the ones being drafted, while others were against the war because the anti-war movements grew increasingly popular among the counterculture and the drug culture in American society and its music. Some advocates within the peace movement advocated the unilateral withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. One reason given for the withdrawal is that it would contribute to a lessening of tensions in the region and thus less human bloodshed. Early opposition to U.S. involvement in Vietnam, it drew its inspiration from the Geneva Conference of 1954. American support of Diem in refusing elections was seen as thwarting the democracy America claimed to support. John F. Kennedy, while senator, opposed involvement in Vietnam. The United States began drastically reducing their troop support in South Vietnam during the final years of Vietnamization. Many U.S. troops were removed from the region, and on the 5th of March 1971, the United States returned the 5th Special Forces Group, which was the first American unit deployed in South Vietnam, to its former base in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Under the Paris Peace Accords between North Vietnamese Foreign Minister Lee Duc Tho and U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, and reluctantly signed by South Vietnamese President Thieu, U.S. military forces withdrew from South Vietnam and prisoners were exchanged. North Vietnam was allowed to continue supplying communist troops in the South, but only to extend the replacing expended material. Later that year, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Kissinger and Tho, but the Vietnamese negotiator declined it, saying that it was a true peace did not yet exist. The communist leaders expected the ceasefire terms would favor their side, but Saigon, bolstered by a surge of U.S. aid received just before the ceasefire went into effect, began to roll back the Viet Cong. The communists responded with a new strategy hammered out in a series of meetings in Hanoi in March 1973, according to the memoirs of Tran Van Tra. With the northern half of the country under their control, the Politburo ordered General Deng to launch the final offensive against Saigon. The operation plan for the Ho Chi Minh campaign, called called for the capture of Saigon before the 1st of May. Hanoi wished to avoid the coming monsoon and prevent any redeployment of ARVN forces defending the capital. Northern forces, their morale boosted by their recent victories, rolled on, taking Nha Trang, Cam Ranh, and Dalat. On 7th of April, 3 North Vietnamese divisions attacked Giao Loc, 40 miles east of Saigon. The North Vietnamese met fierce resistance at Xuan Loc at the ARVN 18th Division, who were outnumbered 6 to 1. For 2 bloody weeks, severe fighting raged as the ARVN defenders made a last stand to try and block the North Vietnamese advance. By the 21st of April, however, their exhausted garrison were ordered to withdraw towards Saigon. An embittered and tearful President Thieu resigned on the same day, declaring that the United States betrayed South Vietnam in a scathing attack. He suggested the U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had attacked him into signing the Paris Peace Agreement 2 years earlier, promising military aid that failed to materialize. Having transferred power to Tran Van Huong, he left for Taiwan on the 25th of April. At the same time, North Vietnamese tanks had reached Bien Hoa and turned towards Saigon, brushing aside isolated ARVN units along the way. Chaos, unrest, and panic broke out as the hysterical South Vietnamese officials and civilians scrambled to leave Saigon. Martial law was declared. American helicopters began evacuating South Vietnamese, U.S., and foreign nationals from various parts of the city and from the U.S. Embassy compound. Operation Frequent Wind had been delayed until the last possible moment because the U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin's belief that Saigon could be held and that a political settlement could be reached. Schlesinger announced early in the morning of 29th April 1975 the evacuation of Saigon by helicopter of the last U.S. diplomat, military, and civilian personnel. Frequent Wind was arguably the last helicopter evacuation in history. It began on 29th of April in an atmosphere of desperation as hysterical crowds of Vietnamese vied for limited space. Martin pleaded with Washington to dispatch $700 million in emergency aid to bolster the regime and help it mobilize fresh military reserves, but American public opinion had soured on this conflict. In the United States, South Vietnam had perceived as doomed, as President Gerald Ford had given a television speech on the 23rd of April declaring at the end of the Vietnam War and all of U.S. aid. Frequent Wind continued around the clock. As North Vietnamese tanks breached defenses on the outskirts of Saigon in the early morning hours of the 30th of April, the last U.S. Marines evacuated the embassy by helicopter. As civilians swamped the perimeter and poured into the grounds, many of them had been employed by the Americans and were left to their fate. On the 30th of April, 1975, NVA entered the city of Saigon and quickly overcame all resistance, captured key buildings and installations. A tank from the 324th Division crashed through the gates of Independence Palace at 11:30 a.m. local time, and the Viet Cong flag was raised above it. President Duong Van Minh, who had succeeded Huong days later, surrendered. The U.S. dropped over 7 million tons of bombs on Indochina during the war, more than triple the 2.1 million tons of bombs the U.S. dropped in Europe and Asia during all of World War II, and more than 10 times the amount dropped by the U.S. during the Korean War. 500,000 tons were dropped on Cambodia, 1 million tons were dropped in North Vietnam, and 4 million tons were dropped in South Vietnam. On per capita basis, the 2 million tons dropped on Laos make it the most heavily bombed country in history. The New York Times noted this was nearly a ton for every person in Laos. Former U.S. Air Force official Earl Tilford had recounted repeated bombings runs off a lake in central Cambodia. The B-52 literally dropped their payloads in the lake. The Air Force ran many missions of this kind for the purpose of securing additional funding. During budget negotiations, so the amount of tonnage expended does not directly correlate with the resulting damage. The U.S. service rifle was initially the M14. Found to be unsuitable for jungle warfare, the M14 was replaced by the M16, which was a more accurate and lighter than the AK-47. For the period, the gun suffered from a jamming flaw known as failure to extract, which means that the spent cartridge case remained lodged in the action after a round is fired. According to a congressional report, the jamming was caused primarily by a change in gunpowder, which was done without adequate testing and reflection, a decision for which the safety of soldiers was secondary consideration. The issue was resolved in early 1968 with the issuance of the M16A1 that featured a chrome-plated chamber among with several other features. End user satisfaction with the M16 was high except during this period, but the M16 still has a reputation as a gun that jams easily. The M16 machine gun, the GPMG, was the main machine gun in the U.S. Army at the time, and many of them were put on helicopters to fight suppressive fire when landing in hostile regions. The MAC-10 machine pistol was supplied to many special forces troops at the midpoint of the war. It also armed many CIA agents in the field.